Elowyn was a lonely girl. She had no wolf, no title, no place in the pack hierarchy, just a borrowed dress, a dead mother's hem let out twice, and 7 years of learning to survive in the margins of a world that had forgotten her name. And nobody was precisely what made her dangerous. On the night of her majority rite, the one ceremony that should have finally given her a place, the Alpha King himself stepped down from his throne, crossed the floor, and took her hand. 3 steps. 1 breath. And then he looked at her like she was something that had broken open a locked door he'd spent years sealing shut. Then he dropped her hand, stepped back, and in front of 300 witnesses, rejected her. But here's what no one in that hall knew. Not the pack, not his council, not even Elowyn herself. A child had already set something in motion. A wish made in secret. A curse woven into the bond before the rejection could erase it. So why did the most powerful alpha in the northern reaches choose to destroy the one thing fate had given him? Watch the full video to find out what really happened that night. The great hall of Greyhall smelled of pine tar and old stone and the breath of 300 gathered souls. Elowyn stood at the center of it, a still point in the churning, and felt every single one of those breaths as a separate weight pressing against her ribs. She wore her good dress, the dark blue wool her mother had sewn 2 winters before she died. The hem had been let out twice. The fabric remembered a smaller girl. Torches lined the walls in iron sconces, their light more shadow than illumination, throwing everything into amber and black. The crowd formed a ring around the open floor, lichened men and women whose eyes caught the firelight in that particular way. A flash of gold, brief and inhuman, quickly suppressed. Children peered between adult hips. The elders sat highest, their faces arranged into expressions of careful neutrality. No one spoke. The rite of majority was, for every other young lichen, a moment of emergence. The inner wolf rose to the surface for the first time, felt, visible, real, and the pack recognized one of their own. Elowyn had watched 17 such ceremonies. She knew the particular sound the crowd made when the bond was confirmed. A collective exhale. A release. Tonight there would be no exhale. She knew this. She had always known this. She was here because absence of ceremony was still ceremony, and she would not give them the satisfaction of her staying away. She held her hands loose at her sides. She breathed. Then the throne moved. Not the throne itself, the figure upon it. Calum Duskmore, Alpha King of the 7-Pack Alliance of the Northern Reaches, rose from his carved oak seat and stepped down from the dais. The silence, which had already been absolute, became something else entirely. No one moved on a dais during a majority rite. It simply was not done. The ceremony flowed toward the throne, never away from it. Elowyn watched him descend the 3 stone steps with that particular quality of stillness that powerful men carry. Not stillness born of peace, but of such complete control that no movement escapes without intention. He was tall. He had always been tall, even in memory, even seen from a distance. And distance was where Elowyn had always kept him. 30 years old, which in a lichen span was barely past youth's first hardening, but the lines at the corners of his amber eyes were not young lines. They were the kind that come from standing in cold wind and making decisions that leave marks. His hair was black, not dark brown, black, the way the space between winter stars is black, absorbing rather than merely absent of light. Elowyn did not move. She measured her breathing, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. She had been doing this since she was 11 years old and found that it was the only thing standing between herself and the yawning dark. He crossed the floor. Each step he took compressed something in her chest, some chamber she'd thought sealed, mortared shut, permanently out of service. She felt it the moment the distance between them dropped below 10 feet, a pull, deep in her sternum, like a fishhook set into cartilage. Not painful, worse than painful. It was the feeling of something recognizing something else, and the recognition was... She had no name for it. A thread, a tether, a knowing. He stopped in front of her. His eyes were amber in the torchlight. The crowd behind him had begun to breathe again, very quietly, the way people breathe when they are trying not to exist. For 3 seconds, she counted them in her own pulse. He looked at her with an expression she did not have a category for. Not disdain, not pity. Something splintered and immediate and quickly shuttered like a window slammed against weather. He extended his hand. She took it. His palm was warm and rough-textured, calloused in the particular way of someone who has held weapons since childhood. When his fingers closed around hers, the hook in her chest yanked, and she made no sound, and she kept her face exactly as she had trained it to be. Still water, still water, still water. For a moment, he was still, too. One hand at her waist, one holding hers, and they were standing close enough that she could smell the cold air still caught in his clothes, pine and iron, wind and something underneath that she had no name for. Something that made the back of her throat go strange. They had taken precisely 3 steps in something that was not quite dancing when she felt it. The hand at her waist went rigid. The warmth of it became deliberate stillness. She looked up at his face. He had gone pale. He released her. The step backward was small, precise, and devastating. "I reject the bond," he said. His voice carried. It always carried. 3 words, clear and flat, and carrying the weight of a man who has given orders in battle, who has spoken sentences that ended in blood. The crowd made a sound Elowen had never heard them make before. A collective inhalation, sharp with shock, threaded through with something uglier. Whisper shapes formed at the edges. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on a point just past his left shoulder. "May I ask," she started. "The bond will not be pursued," he said. "Not to her, to the hall." That is the Alpha's ruling. Elowen's mouth closed. She looked at him then, directly. She watched him not look back. Watched him find a point above the crowd, held there by some internal discipline that cost him something, because she could see the muscle working in his jaw, a single involuntary give. "Then I accept," she said. She turned and walked through the crowd, which parted for her the way water parts around stone. She did not hurry. She did not look back. She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her forefinger, a small, precise pain, and used it as a compass point for the rest of the crossing. She kept walking. Somewhere behind her, in the crowd, a pair of young eyes watched her go. Small eyes, storm gray like her sister's, in a face whose expression was not grief, but something harder. Something that had already made up its mind. The fire in his chamber had burned down to coals. Caleb stood at the window with his hands braced on the stone ledge and looked out at the dark line of ashwood pressing against the eastern wall of the grounds, and told himself things. He was good at this. He had years of practice. She has no wolf. The pack requires strength. The decision was correct. The coals shifted. A log cracked. He told himself these things and found, to his considerable displeasure, that his body was not listening. His hands were still warm. That was the detail that refused to leave, the warmth of her palm against his, smaller than I'd expected, rougher than it should have been for a girl who'd lived under Carven protection these past 7 years. She'd worked for the Calluses. He filed that away without meaning to. Aldrich found him there, as Aldrich always found him, having the conversations Caleb was having with himself. "The council will need a statement," Aldrich said from the doorway. "The statement is what I gave the hall." "A more formal—" "Aldrich!" He didn't turn around. A beat. Then Aldrich's footsteps crossed the threshold, the soft, deliberate tread of a man who has spent 20 years knowing when to advance and when to hold. "There will be questions about her future arrangements," Aldrich said. His voice was careful. Aldrich's voice was always careful, but this particular variety of careful was the one he used when he was about to say something Caleb would not like. A strategic match might be arranged, with Brennan's youngest son, perhaps. Calum turned around. Aldrich stopped speaking. He had the sense, after 20 years, to stop speaking. "Get out," Calum said. "My lord, out." Aldrich went. Calum stood alone in the cooling room and breathed through something he refused to name. The fire exhaled its last light. In the dark behind his eyes, 7 years old in his memory. Ashwood, dawn gray and wet with fog, and the sound of breathing where breathing shouldn't be. He'd been 23 when the feral pack struck. 3 weeks into his reign, the ink barely dry on the ledgers of sovereignty, and the northeastern border had collapsed in 3 hours. He'd ridden with 40 men into Ashwood and found what was left. She'd been 11. She had been sitting in the dark of a birch root cave, knees drawn to her chest, back straight as a soldier's. When his torch found her, she'd looked at the light without flinching, and he had expected, what? Tears. Reaching hands. 11 years old, alone in the dark after God knew what hours. But she had simply looked at him with gray eyes that held the particular quality of someone who has decided not to break, and the decision is so complete it has become physiological. "Are you Calum Duskmore?" she'd said. "Yes." "My parents went to find the others. Are they—" "We'll find them," he'd said. Because that was what you said. Because the truth would wait 1 more hour, and she had already survived enough hours. He'd carried her out of the cave because she'd allowed it. And she hadn't made a sound the whole long walk back to camp. And the next morning, when they told her about her parents, she had asked only one question. "Is my sister safe?" That was the thing he could not stop remembering. His mother had asked about her once, 3 winters ago. Not by name, but by description. "The girl from the cave," she'd said, standing at the window the way she always stood. "Does she manage well?" He had said yes, which was not a lie, and changed the subject, which was. Not the grief he'd expected, not the falling apart. The single pivot, immediate and complete, away from her own devastation toward the one thing she could still protect. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the window frame. "She will survive this," he told himself. "She always does." It was not comfort. It was a fact, and facts were the currency he dealt in. And sometimes facts were the cruelest things in any room. The candle in the Carvin house had gone out an hour ago. Aylwin lay on her back in the narrow bed she shared with Mira, listening to her sister's breathing. Slow and deep and utterly untroubled. The breathing of someone who has decided that whatever tomorrow holds, the night belongs to rest. One of Mira's hands had migrated in sleep, and now lay open on Aylwin's wrist, a small, unconscious anchor. The roof beams creaked in the wind. Outside, the pines moved. Aylwin allowed herself one tear, just one. She'd learned this the hard way. Grief given too much room becomes a flood, and floods don't stop at the walls you build for them. One tear meant the thing had been felt, acknowledged, properly received. One tear, and then the door closed. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye, and then lowered her arm and stared at the dark above her. "He saw me," she thought. For the first time in 7 years, of the same halls, the same ceremonies, the same edge of the same crowd. He actually saw me. And then he looked away. The timeline was merciless. 3 steps, 1 exhale, the words that followed. She turned her mind over it methodically, the way she turned over every problem, without sentiment, cataloging the logic. An alpha king required strength. She had no wolf, no fighting capability beyond the woodcraft she'd spent years teaching herself, because she had no other option. The pack had 19 breeding-age women who could shift and fight and run. She was not among them. He made the right decision. She thought it flatly, and kept thinking it, until it settled. Beside her, Mira shifted. The small hand on her wrist tightened briefly, then relaxed. Then, just before sleep, she heard it. A murmur from the pillow next to hers, barely formed, more breath than words. It will be different. Elowen turned her head to look at her sister's face. Mira's eyes were closed. Her expression was the perfect blankness of deep sleep. Talking in her dreams, Elowen thought. She closed her own eyes. 3 days later, Calum Duskmore disappeared. The knock at the Carven House door came before sunrise. The guardroom had reported the missing key that morning. No one had come to the Carven House yet, but they would. Eowyn had noted the particular quality of Aldrich's silence when he'd told her. The way his eyes had moved briefly to Mira and then away. The way a man's eyes move when he suspects something he is not yet ready to confirm. Eowyn was already awake. She was always awake before sunrise, a habit formed in the years after their parents died, when she developed the useful skill of waking at the slightest change in ambient sound. She was pulling her boots on when Mira appeared in the doorway at the small bedroom, already dressed, face arranged into an expression of extreme seriousness that sat oddly on a child's features. "Aldrich is downstairs," Mira said. A different kind of cold moved through Eowyn's chest. Not the cold of grief, she knew that one by its particular quality, its slowness. This was the cold of information not yet received. Aldrich stood in the carven sitting room with his hat in his hands, which told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. Aldrich's hands were always occupied or still. Nervousness with them was a signal, not a habit. "The Alpha is missing," he said, without preamble, because, as of last night, he was at Lady Leora's residence in the southern quarter. She woke alone. The room felt very bright. Eowyn's ears rang, a clean, high tone, quickly suppressed. "What did Leora say?" she asked. That he'd been speaking in his sleep, responding to someone, she thought, though she couldn't hear who. And then, his jaw moved. Gone. She found the window open and the bed cold. What time? She estimates before first light. Which means he'd been gone at least 2 hours before the alarm was raised. Aldrich's eyes moved to her face with a precision that told her she was being assessed. And she let him assess, because there was nothing to find. She folded her hands at her back. "I need to know," he said, very carefully. "If you had any contact." "The bond was refused," she said. "Before the full council, before 300 witnesses. There is no contact to have." Aldrich studied her for a moment longer. She returned his look with the gray patience she'd been practicing since she was 11 years old. "We're assembling trackers," he said finally. "The forest will be searched, starting at dawn." "I'll go." "You won't," he said, and the words were not unkind. "Go home, Eowyn. Let us handle this." From the corner of the room, Mira's voice arrived, light as smoke and twice as deliberate. "Maybe he's already dead." "Mira." Eowyn's voice was a line in the air between them, sharp-edged. Mira said nothing else, but her expression, when Eowyn looked at her, was not the expression of a child who had said something wrong. It was the expression of a child who was waiting. The first thing was cold. It entered through the pause. That detail did not immediately register as strange. Cold ground, damp leaves, the particular mineral smell of ancient forest floor pressed against the side of his face. His face. Calum opened his eyes, and the world arrived at a different angle, a different scale, a different color temperature. Everything saturated, everything moving, every shadow separated into its constituent parts of smell and sound, with a clarity that human senses only approximated. He was Wolf. He lay on the floor of Ashwood in the dark before dawn, and he was Wolf. Lycan shifted in sleep sometimes, when the stress ran too deep and the human architecture of the mind couldn't hold the weight of it. He had done it himself, years ago, in the first months after his father died. Had woken Wolf in his own bed, scrambled back to himself in the gray morning, said nothing to anyone. He tried to shift back. The stillness where the change should have been was total, like pressing against a locked door, like reaching for a word that had been removed from language. He tried again. Nothing. Then, very deliberately, he tried a third time, and this time he paid attention to what he was pressing against. Not just the absence of the shift, but the texture of the absence. And what he found was not his own resistance, not the body fighting the mind's intent, but something external. A net of pressure, fine as spider silk but strong as iron chain, woven through his coat and into the bones beneath. Bound, some part of him understood. He stood. The forest floor received his weight without sound. 300 pounds of black wolf, moving with the particular economy of something that has been predatory since before language. He shook himself, felt the pressure shift and resettle. Find the mate, something said, from below the human layer. Find her. He had no name for her, not in this form. Names were human structures, and he was increasingly not that. But there was a scent. Wood smoke and pine resin, and something warm underneath, something that pulled at him the way a river pulls at rain. He turned north. He began to run. Elowyn did not wait. She went to Leora's house at first light. The Queen received her in the way that beautiful women sometimes received those they considered beneath them, with a kind of performance of graciousness that was really just condescension in a nicer dress. Elowyn stood in the doorway of the sitting room and did not move and said nothing. And eventually Leora ran out of performances and gave her what she'd come for. He said a name, Leora said finally, in the manner of someone surrendering rather than offering. In his sleep. I couldn't hear it clearly. A woman's name, I think. Elowyn thanked her and left. She took the long route back, past the North Tower. The single window was lit, as it always was at this hour. She did not stop. She had not yet found a reason to. She had 3 routes into Ashwood that the trackers didn't know about. Not because she'd hidden them, because no one had thought to ask her. She had been learning things for 7 years. Her father had been a warrior. Her mother had been a healer herbalist with a knowledge of the forest floor that Elowyn had absorbed like rain into soil, not through formal instruction, but through proximity, through following those particular footsteps until the knowledge of which root bends under pressure and which stands firm became instinct. After they died, with no wolf to join pack hunts, no place in the fighting formation, she'd had 2 options: accept ornamental uselessness or become something else. She'd become something else. She moved through the eastern edge of Ashwood, where the canopy closed and the tracker teams didn't bother, because nothing of interest ever happened in the places that looked like nothing. The forest was too quiet. That registered before anything visual. The bird silence that preceded large predators. The held breath of small creatures in their holes. She smelled him before she saw him. Not his human scent, she didn't know that, had no archive for it, had never been close enough. But she smelled the otherness, the thick animal warmth of a large lichen in wolf form, directional and close, from the shadows between 2 ancient oaks. He was enormous. She'd known the alpha's wolf was large. The stories said 3 times the size of a common pack wolf. The stories, she now understood, had been conservative. He was black, not dark gray, not brown-black, but the absolute black of old river water. And he stood at the tree line with a quality of stillness that reminded her, with a sudden vertigo, of the man who'd stood at the dais and looked at her with that shuttered amber gaze. The eyes. She looked at the eyes and felt something move sideways in her chest. Amber. The particular warm amber of... He wasn't moving. She wasn't moving. The forest didn't move. A frozen tableau in the cold morning light, and she felt the wind against the back of her neck and thought, with extreme precision, I have no wolf. I cannot communicate. I am standing in open ground with an unidentified wolf of unusual size, and I have exactly nothing. Then the wolf sat down. He sat down, in the way of a very large, very deliberate creature that is making a point, and tilted his head. The same quality of tilt a dog makes when it is listening to something it can't quite place. like he was trying to tell her something. 3 of Aldrich's trackers came through the tree line 30 seconds later. The silver chains were not decorative. Eowyn stood in the courtyard of Greyhall and watched them tighten around the massive black wolf, who had not fought the capture, had stood still while the chains were applied, with the expression that a wolf can have, which is mostly in the eyes and the set of the head. And this, more than anything else, was the detail she couldn't put down. He wasn't fighting. The creature protected her, one of the trackers had said when they brought her in. 3 of us. It took down 3 of us like brushing away flies, and then stood in front of her. Aldrich's face had gone through several expressions very quickly. Now he stood opposite her in the courtyard, in the gray afternoon light, and asked his questions in the careful, methodical way of someone who was extremely concerned, and was using method as a wall between himself and the concern. You had no prior contact with this wolf? No. You have no explanation for why it would defend you? None. The bond was refused, she said, before the full council, on the Alpha's explicit declaration. You were there. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. She watched him look at the chained wolf and watched the wolf look back. That amber gaze, steady and unblinking, and something moved in Aldrich's face that she couldn't read. According to Pack law, he said, under Article 7 of the Ashenvale Accords, the formal dissolution of a fated bond requires declaration before the full council, not merely before the assembled pack. He paused. The Alpha made his declaration before the pack. The council was not formally convened. Eowyn's fingers stilled at her sides. Meaning? Meaning the bond has been verbally rejected, but not legally dissolved. He met her eyes. Meaning you retain standing, technically, in matters of the Alpha's person and estate. The chains moved. The wolf made a sound. Low, resonant, a vibration more felt than heard. And she turned to look at it and found those amber eyes on her face, and the hook in her chest pulled. And she pressed her thumbnail hard into her forefinger, until the sensation resolved into something manageable. If this wolf killed the Alpha, Aldrich continued, and now his voice had a quality she recognized as, under pack law, it would face execution by dawn. The wolf looked at her. She looked at the wolf. In the distance, a door creaked on its hinges. The chains had been on for 6 hours when Mira came. This was not impulsive. Mira had never been impulsive in her life, which was the thing adults consistently failed to understand about her. They looked at 11 years old and saw impulse. They saw the quick tongue and the bright eyes, and the way she occupied space like she'd already claimed it. And they concluded she acted without thinking. She thought more than most adults she knew. She simply thought differently, sideways, through stories, through the internal logic of old things. She had read every mythology text in the Carven Library twice over by age 8. She had read the text in Orange Shop in Mirewood, the ones visible through the window, and the ones she'd convinced Saren to let her browse on slow afternoons. She had read about the old compact, and the Wishmaker's rules, and the conditions of binding and dissolving. She had taken very careful notes. The wolf woke when she was 3 steps away. It was larger than she'd expected, even knowing. Its head came level with her shoulder when it rose from the ground, and the amber eyes found her immediately in the dark. And Mira held herself very still and said, in a low voice that carried authority well beyond her 11 years, "You cannot stay here. They will kill you in the morning." The wolf looked at her. She looked back. "I know who you are," she said, "which is why I'm here." She held up the key, taken from the guard room with the ease of someone who had been making herself invisible in the presence of inattentive adults for years. "The mate bond is still legally intact. That matters. You need to understand that it matters." She worked the first lock. Her hands were steady. She had decided they would be steady before she'd left the house, and so they were. "Chikun ang," she murmured, and then, catching herself, in the common tongue, "She needs you. Not here, not chained. She needs you to still be alive, and eventually yourself again." She looked up at the amber gaze. "There's a way back, but you can't do it from a cage." The chain fell. The wolf stood, and for one terrible second she thought it wouldn't move. Thought it would do some incomprehensible creature thing that ignored everything she'd arranged. But then it stepped toward her, close enough that the heat of it was palpable against her face, and it lowered its enormous head and pressed its nose, briefly, very gently, to the top of her hair. Then it turned and ran. Mira stood alone in the dark courtyard and breathed. She went back to her room, climbed into the bed beside her sleeping sister, and opened the old mythology text to the page she'd marked. She read the same 2 lines again, by the last of the moonlight. By day, the beast. By night, the man. Beside the line, in her own careful handwriting, full moon. She turned the book face down. She waited. Mira wanted a story. This was normal, had been normal for as long as Elwyn could remember, the nightly ritual of it. Mira tucked under the quilt with only her face visible, demanding tales that Elwyn recited from memory, or half-invented, depending on what the day had required. It was less normal that Elwyn's voice was tired in a different way than usual. "The Knight and the White Lion," she said, because it was Mira's favorite, because sometimes the familiar was the kindest option. She began. A prince. A curse. A transformation that the prince's beloved couldn't see through because she was looking too hard at the wrong things. The shape, not the substance. "Why did the knight test her?" Mira said, interrupting at the usual place. "He wanted to know if she was brave enough to choose him, when there was nothing to guarantee she'd be right." "That's cruel. Or it's honest." Elwyn adjusted the quilt. He was giving her the chance to find out what she was made of. You can't know that without the test. Mira was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. "If the prince was cursed," she said carefully, "and by day he was a beast, but by night he came back, what brought him back?" Elwyn looked at the ceiling. The person braver than his fear. And what if the person brave enough was afraid too? "Everyone is afraid." She said it simply, because it was simple. Being brave enough doesn't mean not being afraid. It means moving anyway. Mira made a small sound. It might have been agreement. On the nightstand, the old mythology book sat face down on a page Elwyn hadn't read. She didn't look at it. She didn't know to look at it yet. "Go to sleep," she said. Mira went, but her eyes, behind their closed lids, held the quick movement of someone running through calculations. In the morning, Mira, hummed while she made the fire. An old tune, something their mother used to sing. She stopped halfway through, her hands stilling on the kindling, her face going briefly blank. Then she continued with a different tune, one she'd made up herself, and said nothing about the interruption. She was in the great hall, not the great hall as it was, full and loud and treacherous with watching eyes. The great hall empty, just stone and firelight, the smell of old pine and smoke, and the sound of her own footsteps. Calum was already there. He stood in the center of the floor in the amber light, in the same clothes he'd worn at the ceremony. She noticed that and filed it away, this absurd note-taking that her brain performed even in sleep. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her that night, directly, without the shudder. "You're my mate," he said. "You rejected me," she said. "I'm here." "You disappeared." He crossed to her, and she let him, because this was a dream, and the rules were different. And when his hand came up and curved around the side of her face, she felt the warmth of it like a physical fact, too precise to be invented. "Why did you accept so easily?" he said, and his voice was different here, stripped of its alpha register, of the carrying quality and the deliberate flatness. Here it was rough at the edges. Here it was uncertain, which was a word she had never once associated with Calum Duskmore in her waking life. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Because it was the only kind thing," she didn't say. "Because I have been making myself easier to discard for years, and I have become very efficient at it." She woke up with the sheets twisted and her eyes wet and the particular post-dream disorientation of someone who has been somewhere real. She lay still. The dream warmth of his hand faded from her cheek, degree by degree. She sat up. The territory still needed managing. Lord Brennan's riders had been spotted at the eastern border. The granary reports were 3 days overdue. She had a list of 14 things to do before the sun reached midday. Chapter 11. A Territory Without a Center. Winter had begun its slow invasion of the Ashenvale Valley. Aylwin could feel it in the way the morning air had changed, the cold acquiring teeth, frost crystals on the inner stone of windowsills, the river carrying a new gray quality like lead worked thin. The pines didn't change, they only darkened. It had been 2 weeks since the Alpha disappeared. Lord Brennan arrived on the 12th day. He came with 40 riders and a smile that had never in its life meant the thing it looked like. He came under the banner of Fraternal Alliance and Support in a Time of Difficulty, and requested an audience with the Beta, and during that audience managed to suggest, in the course of 40 minutes of genial conversation, that perhaps the Ashenvale territory might benefit from closer integration with Ironfin's administrative structure, given the current leadership uncertainty. Elowyn was not at the audience. She heard about it in the afternoon, from Thea Carvin, who was young enough to still be outraged by things that deserved outrage. She was in the middle of 3 things simultaneously when Thea finished. She was reading the granary reports, she was calculating how long the current stores would sustain the pack through a hard winter, and she was adding up, in her head, the political arithmetic of what Aldrich would do if he concluded that Brennan's offer was the practical option. She went to the council room. Gregor looked up from his chair at the head of the table, with the expression of a man interrupted at something important by something he didn't consider important. "This is a closed session," he said. "I have a proposal for the Brennan question," she said. "You don't sit on this council." "I'm not asking to sit. I'm asking to speak." She stood in the doorway and did not move. 3 minutes. "Then I'll go." "You don't—" "3 minutes," Aldrich said from the other end of the table. Gregor's mouth closed. Elowyn stepped inside. She spoke for 3 minutes. She had the proposal structured precisely. A counteroffer that would acknowledge Brennan's territorial interest while binding him to specific non-interference clauses. Buying the pack 3 months of time in legal protection without surrendering any actual sovereignty. She had the precedent cases and the relevant legal text. She had done this in her room at 4 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. When she finished, Gregor laughed. Not the kind that meant something was funny. "A girl with no wolf is going to teach us law?" he said. She left the room with her hands very still at her sides and her face very still, and the inside of her mouth tasting like copper where she'd bitten her cheek. In the corridor, alone, she pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed. "People with no fangs learn to become invisible," her old teacher had said. But invisible, she understood now, was only the first step. The second step was learning when to be seen. She thought of her father. No fangs? Use your head. She thought of Calum, who had carried her out of a birch root cave and said nothing about what came next, because some things waited for when you were ready. She pushed off the wall. There was a wolf somewhere in Ashwood. She was going to find it. Chapter 12. 9 Nights of Watching. The oaks on the eastern edge of Ashwood were old enough that their lowest branches were still 20 feet from the ground. Elowyn climbed them anyway. It took her the better part of an hour the first night. She'd done it before, in daylight, for practice. But darkness complicated the holds in ways that had to be relearned with the body, rather than the eyes. By the 5th night, she could do it in 12 minutes. By the 9th, without thinking. She positioned herself in the highest crook where 2 branches met, where her scent would be scattered by the wind, and her silhouette would disappear against the canopy. And she waited. The arrows were tipped with poppy extract concentrate, diluted to a level she'd calculated carefully against average lichen body weight. enough to induce unconsciousness for 2 to 4 hours. Not enough for anything permanent. She'd tested the dilution 3 times. She was thorough about these things. Nights 1 through 8? Nothing. Or rather, not nothing. The forest was alive, as it always was, with the particular living dark of old woodland, but nothing of the size or signature she was looking for. The 9th night, the moon was behind clouds. The cold had acquired a new precision that found the gaps in her cloak, and she had been in the tree for 4 hours and was beginning to reconsider the structural viability of her plan, when the undergrowth 30 meters south shifted in a way that had nothing to do with wind. She went still. He emerged into the small clearing below her tree, like a piece of the dark that had decided to have shape. The size of him never stopped being arresting. Even at 20 feet up, with the psychological safety of elevation, she felt it. The particular recalibration of scale that happened in the presence of something apex. He moved through the clearing with his head low, scenting, and she held her breath and did not move, and watched him. He stopped. He lifted his head. The amber eyes found her in the canopy, as though she were lit. She fired. He moved, not away, but sideways, fluid and immediate, like water redirected, and the arrow passed through where he'd been and fell somewhere in the undergrowth. He was fast. She'd known he'd be fast. She drew again, and he was moving again, and she tracked the movement and released on instinct rather than aim. The way her old teacher had said was the only way to hit things that didn't want to be hit. Miss. She dropped from the tree. This was, objectively, impulsive. This was the kind of thing she would have told Mira never to do. She dropped from 20 feet, which with her training and the angle of the lower branches, resolved to a drop of about 12, and she hit the ground running and went after him. Because she had done the mathematics, and she had 2 more shots, and he would not run forever. He stopped. In the center of the clearing, in the gap where the canopy opened, and the cloud-covered moon cast its diffused and almost luminous gray light, he stopped and turned and sat down, and put his head down, and exposed the top of his skull to her, in the particular posture of a wolf making itself deliberately smaller. Submission. She stopped 6 feet away, arrow still knocked, and looked at him. He looked at her with amber eyes that were doing something she couldn't name, something that lived below animal and above human, in the space between the two that she suspected most people were too afraid to look into directly. "Please," said the eyes. Or she imagined that. She was probably imagining that. She fired. The cloud shifted. The moon arrived. The black wolf became a man, sudden and complete, and the man collapsed face down in the frost grass with an impact that she felt in her own bones. She moved to him. She knelt. She turned him, carefully, finding leverage, and when she got his face clear of the ground, she looked at him, at the closed eyes, the slack exhaustion of features that in waking were always controlled, and she was reaching for the collar of his shirt when she saw the scar. Small, crescent-shaped, left side of his throat, faded to pale silver. The kind of scar that a lichen's healing leaves behind when the original wound was too deep or too fast. She knew that scar. She had been 13 years old and 40 feet up an ashwood oak at the western border, doing exactly the kind of thing she shouldn't have been doing, when Calem's pack had ridden out to repel a feral incursion. She had watched from the tree with her heart in her throat as a wolf twice the size of his companions drove through 3 fighters and got its jaws into the neck of the black wolf at the center of the formation before it was beaten back. The black wolf had not made a sound. She had remembered the scar the way she remembered everything she wasn't supposed to notice. "Calem," she said. It was barely a sound. "Ugh," he groaned. Chapter 13. The Weight of His Head. His head was in her lap. She hadn't planned that. It was a function of gravity and the practical geometry of the situation. He'd been on his knees, and then he hadn't been, and she'd caught him by instinct, and then he'd been too heavy to reposition without waking him, and so, his head in her lap, in the frost grass of a clearing in Ashwood, at what she estimated was well past midnight. He smelled of cold pine and something darker underneath. Something that the 14-year-old text she'd read described as the particular signature of a dominant lichen, which had sounded clinical when she'd read it and felt nothing like clinical now. His face, unconscious, was... She looked at the tree line. When he began to wake, she knew it by the quality of his stillness, attention entering it, awareness coming back in layers. His breathing changed. Then his hand, on the frost ground beside her knee, flexed. "Don't sit up too fast," she said. A pause, then... "How?" "Poppy, concentrate. Diluted. You'll be fully functional in 3 hours." Another pause. She watched his profile, the line of his jaw, the muscle working there, the process of reassembly happening behind his eyes. "I didn't know you could track," he said, finally. "Most people don't notice what I can do." He turned his head, slowly, and looked up at her from this angle. An angle she suspected very few people had ever seen him from. And the amber eyes were clearer than they'd been in the forest. Not yet fully animal, something returning to the surface. "How long?" he said. "You've been wolf for 2 weeks, maybe less." "It feels..." He stopped. "You're bound," she said. "From outside. There's magic in it, not your own. It's not your body failing you." He was quiet for a moment. Above them, the cloud had drifted back, and the stars were visible in the narrow slice of sky between the canopy edges, very bright and very cold. "Tell me everything about Brennan," he said then. "The council, the Eastern Granary, the tracker team structure, everything." So she did. She talked for an hour while he lay in the frost grass and the night deepened around them, and she watched his eyes track every detail she offered, with the particular quality of a mind that was built for this, for holding large structures of information and finding the weak points in them, for running contingencies in parallel. He asked questions. She answered them. He told her where the secondary alliance contacts lived, which council members held debts he could leverage, where the emergency provision caches were buried in the southern forest. At some point during the hour, without either of them remarking on it, his eyes moved to her face and stayed there, and she was aware of being looked at in a way that was different from being assessed. But she didn't look back, because the first gray of dawn was touching the eastern sky, and she needed to be watching for it. When the light came, so did the change. "I'll come back," she said, very quickly, to the wolf that stood where the man had been. He looked at her. She turned and walked back through the trees. Chapter 14. The Law She Knew. The council chamber smelled of candle tallow and male irritation. Aylwin walked in without knocking. Gregor was on his feet before she'd crossed the threshold, which saved time. "Article 7, she said, before he could speak. She looked at Aldrich, who was at the head of the table, with the expression of someone who has been awake too long and is holding himself together with determination alone. Of the Ashenvale Accords. The formal dissolution of a fated bond requires declaration before the full council, convened with quorum. The declaration before the pack at the majority right did not satisfy this condition. The room was very quiet. "Which means," she continued, "that I retain legal standing in matters of the Alpha's person and estate. Which means I have the right to speak to this council on matters of territorial administration during his absence." She looked at Gregor. "Which is what I'm here to do." "This is," Gregor started. "The law," Aldrich said from the head of the table. His voice had a flatness to it, the particular flatness of someone reading a tide table. "She's correct." More silence. Lord Brennan, who was seated to Aldrich's left, with the comfort of a man who has already begun mentally redecorating the room, raised one eyebrow. She did not look at Lord Brennan for longer than was necessary to acknowledge his presence. "I'll speak briefly," she said. "Then I'll take questions." She spoke for 12 minutes. She laid out the counter-proposal, the legal precedents, the specific wording of the non-interference clauses. She explained how the territory could maintain administrative independence for a period of 6 months without requiring Brennan's protection, using existing resource networks and the alliance contacts she'd been given the night before. When she finished, the silence was different. Who? Morkant, the eldest council member, was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a category for. Who taught you the accords? I read them, she said, several times. The door at the back of the hall opened. The black wolf walked in. 300 pounds of absolute stillness entered the room and moved, with the deliberate calm of something that has decided it will not run, to stand at her left side. The amber gaze moved across the council table with a slow, systematic quality. Not threat. Claim. Brennan's eyebrow dropped. She reached down, without looking, and rested her hand on the great black head at her shoulder. The weight of it solid and warm under her palm, the coarse fur catching between her fingers. The Alpha's proxy requests 3 months of independent administration, she said, pending the Alpha's return. She sat down in the empty chair at the head of the table. She did not look at Brennan again. She was finished with Brennan. Lord Brennan left Greyhall before the evening meal. He left without requesting a formal departure audience, which was either a concession or a calculation. She suspected the latter. His 40 riders followed the southern road out of the valley in good order, which meant he had not yet decided this was over. That was fine. She had not decided it was over either. Chapter 15. What Mira did not say. She told Mira that night. The wolf, Calum, lay in the corner of the bedroom with his eyes half open, watching the conversation with the patience of something that has accepted it cannot participate, but will not leave. Mira listened to the entire account without expression, which, for Mira, was the equivalent of a full performance of carefully managed revelation. When Aelwyn finished, Mira said, "What are you going to do?" "There's a wizard in Mirewood, Orin. I'm going to find out if he knows what kind of binding this is." Something happened to Mira's face. It was small and quickly controlled, but Aelwyn had been reading that face since it was 3 days old. "I've heard things about him," Mira said carefully. "I know what people say. He takes things. I don't have anything worth taking." Aelwyn said it plainly. It was plain. From the corner, the wolf made a sound, a low rumble that was not quite a growl, a vibration that she felt in the floor through her feet. One large paw came down on the boards with a deliberate weight that was unmistakably commentary. She looked at him. "You don't have a vote," she said. He looked back at her with amber eyes full of things he couldn't say, and she held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before she looked away, because 3 seconds was the limit, before it stopped feeling like looking at an inconvenience and started feeling like something else. Mira said nothing. Mira, when Aelwyn glanced at her, had the expression of a chess player watching someone else's game reach a conclusion they'd seen 3 moves ago. "What are you thinking?" Aelwyn thought, but didn't ask. She went to the tower room instead, because she'd been going every week since Calum disappeared, because Lady Isolde had a right to know what was happening in her son's name. The woman was in her chair by the window, looking at the forest. "Calum is alive," Aelwyn said. "I think you should know." Lady Isolde's hands stilled on the arms of the chair. "He's cursed," Aelwyn continued. "I'm working on it." A long silence. The fire in the small hearth popped. "Are you frightened?" Lady Isolde said. Her voice was unused sounding, like a door opened after seasons shut. "Yes." Aelwyn didn't decorate it. "But Mira is more frightened than I am, and I won't let her be frightened for nothing." She turned to go. "Courbet," the older woman said, the old tongue low and unpracticed. "Girl, he watched you, for years. You know that?" Aelwyn stopped. "He thought I didn't notice," Lady Isolde said. "But mothers notice things." The fire popped again. Aelwyn left. Chapter 16. The Man Who Cannot Undo. The wizard's shop smelled of paper and ozone, and the particular indefinable quality of spaces where the air has been changed by repeated use of things that don't belong in ordinary air. Saren met her at the door. "You don't want to come in," Serene said. "I know." Elwyn looked past her at the dark interior. The shelves of bound text and sealed jars, the single lamp burning amber. "I'm coming in anyway." Serene looked at her with the expression of someone doing rapid internal calculations and coming up short. She stood aside. Oren was at the back of the shop, at a work table covered in materials she didn't recognize. He looked 30. He had looked 30 when she was a child here with her mother, and he would look 30 when her grandchildren were grown, which was either beautiful or terrible, depending on which part of the old compact you read first. He looked up. "I can't help you," he said, not unkindly, as one states weather. "You haven't heard what I know why you're here," he said. "The Alpha King. The binding." He set down what he was holding. "I cannot help you, because I was the one who performed the wish." The shop was very quiet. "You bound him," she said. "I performed a wish. The binding that resulted was a consequence of the wish's conditions." He met her eyes. "I cannot undo what I've done. That is the compact's first rule. No wish may nullify a previous wish. The structure doesn't allow it." "Then who can undo it?" He looked at her for a long moment. She watched something happen in his face. A pressure, a tightening, the way a man looks when he is choosing between two things, and neither choice is comfortable. "The wish," he said, with the quality of someone measuring each word, "has conditions. Those conditions are not within my authority to alter or disclose, but I can tell you." He stopped. His face went briefly tight, a compression of some internal pain. "That the answer is not something I can hand to you." The compression passed. Serene was looking at him with large eyes. "Thank you," Elwyn said. She turned to go. "The person who placed the wish," Oren said, to her back, and she stopped, "had very specific motivations." Another pause, longer this time, and when she turned back his face was pale. "I cannot tell you more than—" He stopped mid-sentence, pressing two fingers to his sternum with the expression of someone pressing on a bruise. "Don't," Serene said from beside the door. Elwyn looked at Serene. "When he says things he's not supposed to say," Serene said, "it hurts him, physically." The compact. Elwyn looked at Oren. He had recovered, or was recovering, his face returning to its habitual stillness. "What's your name?" she said. Serene looked startled. "Oren, his name is—" "I know. I was asking him." He looked at her. Something shifted, very slightly in his expression. A small movement around the eyes. "Oren," he said. "No one asks," Serene murmured. "Not to either of them. To the room." Elwyn nodded. She walked home through the cold evening and thought about two men bound by different chains in different shapes, and the strange and terrible loneliness of being trapped in the thing you are. Chapter 17. What the Alpha Sees. She didn't know he was watching her argue. He would not have said the word charming, because charm implied something soft, and he did not traffic in soft. But he would perhaps have said illuminating, which was a word that committed to nothing. He lay across the threshold of the council chamber in the wolf form that had become, over the weeks, less like a prison and more like a second skin. Not accepted, never accepted, but managed, and he watched her. She sat in his chair. She was arguing with Morkant about the eastern supply routes when Gregor interrupted. A cutting interjection, designed to undercut, and he watched her stop. She stopped completely, the way she sometimes did, the full system pause of someone who is choosing their next word with precision. And then she turned to Gregor, and said something in a level voice that made Morkant, across the table, cover a brief smile with his hand. He pressed his nose to the inside of her wrist. Once. Her hand moved, without her looking down, and rested on his head. Just briefly, the weight of it settling through his fur with an ease that told him she'd stopped thinking about it. That she'd been doing it long enough that it had entered the category of automatic. He thought about his mother. He thought about what it had looked like afterward, after his father, after the grief that had hollowed out a woman until what remained was only the outline of her in a chair by a window. He had watched that hollowing for 20 years and told himself, with the systematic determination of someone building a wall, that this was what love did. This was the tax it levied, eventually, on everyone who paid it. She was not like his mother. He had been telling himself this for weeks and had finally, somewhere between the second Brennan negotiation and the granary situation, stopped needing to tell himself, because he had simply seen it. She had been managing a territory in crisis, without a wolf, without council support, without anything except her own mind and a particular quality of will that he recognized because he'd been trying to match it his entire adult life. She doesn't need you to stand behind her, he thought. She needs you beside her. After the session, Gregor made a final comment that landed wrong, and he watched her leave the chamber with her hands loose and her back straight, and her expression perfectly neutral. And he fell into step beside her in the corridor, close enough that his side pressed against her hand. She put her hand on his back without speaking. Her fingers were shaking, very slightly. The specific tremble of controlled emotion, not fear. He slowed to match her pace. Neither of them said anything. The corridor was long. They walked it. Behind them, at the end of the corridor, Aldrich watched them go. His face held something that was not quite grief and not quite anger. The expression of a man who has spent 20 years protecting something and has begun, very recently, to wonder whether protection and control have been the same word in his vocabulary for too long. Chapter 18. The Night He Came Back. Mira had moved to the small room down the hall. "It's crowded," she'd said, with a particular 7-layer Mira deadpan that simultaneously meant the literal thing and 5 other things. "And you talked to him all night anyway." So Elowen slept alone. Or she slept with a wolf the size of a small horse across the foot of the bed, which was a different category of alone. She had begun to have nightmares again, the kind she'd had in the first years after the cave, when 11-year-old memory had processed its contents without her permission in the hours before dawn. She'd thought she was past them. Apparently not. When they came, there was a shift in the weight at the foot of the bed, and a warmth that moved, and then, so light she might have been imagining it, the press of a large cold nose against her temple, and she would wake halfway, and the dark was just the dark, just her room, and the heartbeat close to hers was steady and very large. The full moon rose without announcement on a Tuesday night in early winter. She woke to warmth. Not the warmth of the wolf, a different warmth, the particular heat of a human body, running warmer than a room, and the pressure of it was different geometry, different weight distribution, and she processed this before she opened her eyes, and so when she opened her eyes, she did not make any sound. Calum Duskmore was asleep on her bed. He was on his side, with his back partially toward her, his breathing slow and deep, and the shape of him was— she had not been this close to him since the clearing. She had not looked at him sleeping since the clearing. She had not let herself. She looked. The severity of him was different in sleep. The deliberate flatness of his face, the careful architecture of someone who manages every expression like a border, was absent. What remained was older and younger simultaneously. A face that had been weathered into something, still with the lines of whatever had weathered it. She reached out. She pushed back a strand of dark hair that had fallen across his forehead, barely touching, her fingertip registering the warmth of him, and she was pulling her hand back when he moved. His arm came around her waist, not grabbing, pulling, the way people pull things toward them in sleep without waking. She stopped breathing. His eyes opened, amber in the dark. First animal, then not. She watched the return happening, the layers reassembling, the gold clearing to something more complex. Neither of them moved. It was nothing, she told herself, and knew the word was wrong before she'd finished it, because the warmth of his arm through her sleeve was not nothing, and the way he was looking at her from 6 inches away was not nothing, and the specific quality of the silence between them was very much not nothing. She kissed him, or she started to kiss him, a press at the corner of his mouth that began tentative and stopped being tentative, and his arm at her waist tightened, and then he was kissing her, and she wasn't thinking anymore. Not strategically, not practically, not in any of the structures she'd built to keep everything organized and safe. He stopped. "I can't," he said, and his voice was rough in a way she'd never heard, pulled from somewhere beneath the register he used for the world. And something happened to his face. "You are—" He stopped. The amber eyes were very close. "You are more than enough. That's the thing I can't—" He pulled back. She felt the loss of the arm at her waist as a specific physical fact. A cold where warmth had been. "Calum," Elowen. Her name and his voice, finally, after all the she and her and the avoiding of it. Her name. Her eyes, she realized distantly, were wet. She pressed the heels of her hands against them, sitting up, turning away, and she was on her feet and heading for the door before she decided to move. "Eowyn." She closed the door behind her. In the corridor, in the cold, she stood with her back against the stone and breathed the way she'd been breathing since she was 11 years old, and did the count, and waited for the architecture to reassemble. It took longer than usual. Chapter 19. The Wishmaker's Pain. She went back to Oren 3 times. Each time, he gave her another layer of information, parceled out in the careful way of someone managing a budget of things they're allowed to spend. Each time, the visit cost him something she could see but couldn't quantify. A pallor after she left, a stillness that Serene watched with the focused attention of someone tracking a wound's progress. On the 3rd visit, he told her about the point of no return. A lichen held in animal form beyond a certain threshold, he said, in the careful clinical tone she'd learned meant he was staying within the compact's rules. Will experience progressive deterioration of the human self. Memory, language, reasoning, the structures of will. He paused. The wolf is not the problem. The wolf is simply what remains when the rest erodes. "How long?" she said. "His eyes." He looked at her directly. "When they shift red without provocation, without fear or aggression as cause. When that happens more than twice, you are approaching the threshold." She thought of the corridor at night, his eyes in the dark, the way they sometimes caught the amber candle reflection and went a shade darker, a shade more. "There was a moment," Oren said, and then stopped. His face went tight. Serene made a small sound. "You don't have to," Elowen started. "He rejected you," Oren said, through the tightening, the words forced out against something. "In front of 300. He pressed his hand flat against the table, hard. Stopped. The room was very quiet. Elowen looked at Serene. "When he says things against the compact's neutrality," Serene said, "he pays for them. The cost is—" She looked at Oren, who had his eyes closed. "It's not small." "Stop," Elowen said to Oren. "You don't need to say more." She stood. She looked at him, the young old face, the way it held something she didn't have a word for in any language she knew. The expression of a person who has been doing penance for so long that penance has become identity. She looked at Saren, who was watching Oren the way you watch something you can't afford to lose. "His name is Oren," she said. "No one asks." Saren looked up at her. "I know," Serene said. "I know." Chapter 20. Old Ink and Older Truth. The mythology books lived in Lady Isolde's North Tower, along with everything else the woman had gathered in 20 years of living inside rather than outside. Elwyn read to her every afternoon. This had started practically. The woman was isolated, the accounts were relevant to the territory's history, and Elwyn had always read the way her lungs breathed, without thinking about it. But it had become something else, somewhere in the third week. Something that had more to do with sitting in the same room as someone who had loved the same man and lost him differently. On a Thursday afternoon in deep winter, she found the second version. The Knight and the Great White Bear. Different from the lion, different shape to the metaphor, different details in the telling. But the underlying mechanism was the same. A prince transformed. A beloved who had to learn to see past the transformation. By day, he was the beast, she read. But when the dark drew down, he was himself again. Her fingers stopped. The line had been underlined. Faint ink, brown with age, pressed into the paper by a small hand in a hurry. And beside it, in the margin, in a handwriting she would know anywhere, in the handwriting she'd learned at 7 years old while her father was still alive, and before everything became what it became. Full moon. She stared at it. The warmth of the fire, the sound of Lady Isolde's breathing. Outside, the winter pressed against the tower walls. Full moon. She had not told Mira about what happened on the full moon night. She had not told Mira about Calum returning to human form in her room, about the hours of human conversation before dawn came and took him back, about the way she'd been careful every full moon since to place herself elsewhere, to give him privacy for the return, to not... She had not told Mira. Mira had known. Mira had written this note in this book before any of it had happened. Her throat tightened. She closed the book. She opened it again. She looked at the small handwriting beside the line about beasts and returning, and the thing that moved through her chest was not a small thing, was not a thing she could count to 4 and manage, was not a thing that fit in any of the chambers she'd built. Lady Isolde's hand came to rest on her wrist. Elwyn did not cry, in the end. She sat very still with the older woman's hand on her wrist and breathed, and the fire did what fires do in cold rooms, and the afternoon light turned from white to amber to the deep blue of early winter dark. Chapter 21. The Cost of the Wish. Elwyn put the book on the table between them. It was open to the page, the underlined line, the marginal note. Mira looked at it. She didn't reach for it. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, which was the posture Elwyn recognized as Mira having already arranged herself for something. "You knew," Elwyn said. "Yes." "Before." "Yes." "Mira." She kept her voice level. She was very good at this. "I need you to tell me exactly what you did." And Mira did. She had been, she said, 8 years old when she first read about the old compact in the books their father had brought from Mirewood. She had been 9 when she'd read the specific conditions under which a wishmaker was bound to perform. She had been 10 when she'd walked to Mirewood herself, a 2-hour journey she told Elwyn she was spending at Thea Carvin's, and spoken to Orrin for the first time. "I didn't wish anything that night," Mira said. "I just wanted to see if he was real." And then the ceremony. And then, "He rejected you," Mira said. And something in her voice that was 11 years old and absolutely certain. In front of everyone. And you stood there and said, "I accept." And your voice didn't shake. And I watched your face while you walked out, and no one else was watching your face. They were all watching him. And I saw... She stopped. "I saw what it cost. And I decided." Elwyn was very still. "You could have been wrong," she said. "I know." "He could have." "I know." "He's losing himself, Mira." Her voice cracked on it, just barely, the first give in the architecture, He's losing. Every time his eyes go red, I think about what Oren said about the threshold and I know. Mira's voice was quiet. That's why I gave him a condition. What condition? I can't tell you. She looked at her sister, directly, the way that Mira looked at things she'd decided not to look away from. If I tell you, it won't work. He has to do it himself, of his own will. Without knowing the door is there, only then does it open. Something crashed in the next room. All three of them moved at once. Or, two of them moved, and the wolf was already moving, launched from the corner with a speed that had nothing in it of thought. The collision in the small room was a chaos of sound. Mira's cry, a scramble, the particular sound of instinct not yet knowing what it was protecting from. Eowyn didn't think. She threw herself between the wolf and her sister and said no in a voice that surprised her. Not the soft no of asking, but the hard no of something that will not move. And the wolf's jaws caught her forearm. Not deep. The depth of a reflex catching itself. Jaws closing and then opening. Immediate horror in the amber eyes that had gone briefly red and were already clearing. Mira, unharmed, sat very small against the wall. The wolf backed away. Boots in the corridor. Aldrich's voice. The door opening. The wolf ran. Eowyn looked at the mark on her arm. She pressed her sleeve against it, firmly, and looked at Mira. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No," Mira said. She looked at the empty doorway where he'd been. Something moved in her face that was not quite guilt and was not quite grief. "Tell me the condition," Eowyn said. "I can't," Mira said. "Tell me." But Mira's eyes held the particular quality of someone who had accepted a cost and would not unmake the acceptance. And Eowyn looked at her sister's face and saw 7 years of a child who had been deciding to survive, and she said nothing else. Chapter 22. The Hall and the Locked Door. They locked her in with Lady Isolde and Mira. Aldrich had the particular expression of a man whose architecture of loyalty was being tested against the architecture of his instincts. And the instincts were winning. Amber sparks in his eyes that he was not fully suppressing. His voice rougher than usual. His movements clipped and over-precise. The way movement gets when the body is managing something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. "The creature attacked a pack member," he said. "Under pack law." "He's the alpha," Mira said from behind Eowyn. "We have no proof." "I gave him the curse," Mira said, loudly, into the room. "I went to the wishmaker and I wished it. The wolf is Calum Duskmore. I'll tell you anything you want to know about how it works. But you cannot kill the wishmaker to undo it. It doesn't work that way." The room received this. Aldrich looked at Mira for a long time. "The wishmaker put the alpha under a binding," he said finally, and his voice had taken on the quality Eowyn recognized as Ban-Nang overriding reason. The particular illogic of the herd mind under pressure. "Killing the binding source won't do anything except kill an innocent person," Mira said. Aldrich's jaw worked. He left. He took 20 men toward Mirewood. The door locked. Mira turned to Eowyn and said, "I'll tell you now, while you can still get out." She did. Eowyn listened to every word. She did not look away. When Mira finished, the silence stretched. "The wolf," Eowyn said, in full animal mind. "I have to find him." "Yes." "And let him chase me." "Yes." "And then, you have to let him choose," Mira said, "when he's closest to the animal. The fated bond is stronger than the curse, but only when he acts from his own will, not from the wish's mechanics. If he doesn't because the curse is pulling him, it won't break. It has to be him." Lady Isolde's voice, from the chair. "The passage." They both turned. The old woman was already on her feet, moving to the east wall with a sureness that spoke of long knowledge. "In the stone. My husband showed it to me 20 years ago, for emergencies." She pressed a section of wall. A line of dark appeared. "Go." Elowen went. At the passage entrance, she stopped and looked back at the room, Mira on the floor with her knees to her chest, Lady Isolde standing with her hand against the open stone. "Don't go back to the dark," Lady Isolde said. Her voice was steady. "The way I did. Don't let him be the reason you stop living." Elowen looked at her. "I won't," she said. She meant it. Chapter 23. The Wishmaker Stands. Serene was awake when the drumming of hooves reached the north side of Mirewood. She'd been awake for an hour, sitting in the dark of the upstairs room, with the particular held breath that comes when the body knows something before the mind has articulated it. She went to the window. She counted the torches moving through the tree shadows, more than 20. Amber eyes catching the light. She ran downstairs. Oren was at the front door. He was fully dressed, coat buttoned, as though the night had not been night at all, but merely a delay between this and that. He turned when she entered, and his face had the quality of a man who has been making his peace with something for long enough that the peace is genuine. "We need to go," she said. "You need to go inside," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a ring. Silver, small, the runes on it so fine they were barely visible, worked in a hand that had 300 years of practice. He took her hand and slid it onto her finger. "What?" "Ward," he said. "Nothing magical can touch you while you're wearing it." He released her hand. "Lock the door from the inside." "Oren!" He put his hand against her face. It was such a simple gesture. The flat of his palm against her cheek, warm, for barely a breath, and she understood without being told that it was the gesture of someone who has spent a very long time not allowing themselves simple gestures and has run out of reasons to keep refusing. "I'll be all right," he said. He stepped outside. She heard the lock click from his side with a word she didn't know. She was at the window when Aldrich's men arrived. She watched him stand in front of 30 lichens in wolf shape, and the 2 men remaining human. She watched him say something. She couldn't hear. The glass was thick and her hands were pressed against it. She watched Aldrich's face, visible even at this distance, go through several expressions. Then one of the wolves moved. The largest one, dark gray, the size of a bear, and Oren did not move, did not raise his hands, stood with a quality of absolute stillness that was not the stillness of acceptance and not the stillness of resistance, but something third, something she couldn't name, something that looked like relief, she thought. He looks like relief. The wolf hit him. She hit the window with both palms and screamed, and then every wolf in the clearing went still. Not gradually, immediately, like a string cut. 20 wolf minds snapping back to human in a single second, and the horror on their faces was visible even through the glass. The looking at their own hands quality of people who have woken up somewhere they didn't mean to be. Aldrich knelt in the dirt beside Oren with the posture of a man who has understood, very suddenly and very completely, the nature of his own mistake. Oren was sitting up. His face, when she finally got the door open, she'd been fighting the lock for 2 minutes, her hands shaking. His face was the quietest she'd ever seen it. He looked at the clearing of recovering lichens, at Aldrich's bent head, at the pale morning that was beginning to edge the east, and his expression was the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight so long they've forgotten it as weight, and have just set it down. She sat in the dirt beside him. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. After a while, he said, "I'm going to make breakfast." "It's 4 in the morning," she said. "Roast chicken," he said. "Your father's recipe. I know you think I don't know it, but I've been watching how you eat for 2 years, and I know what you reach for last because it's the one you're saving." She looked at him. "Oh," she said. "Yes," he said. They went inside.